Horizontal Power Hour, your source for anarchist thought, culture, and politics. Today, we have a section from a talk given by Tegan Eanelli, the co-author of a brand new anthology entitled Queer Ultraviolence, which chronicles the queer anarchist non-organization Bashback.
Okay, so I'm Tegan, and I just wanted to thank everyone for coming today. So, obviously, this is going to be a book talk about this book that I co-edited called Queer Ultraviolence, and I'm going to get to that in a minute, but I kind of want to just talk about like a few projects that I'm involved with, just to plug them real quick. This book wouldn't have been possible without a printing project in the Bay Area where I live called LBC Books, which publishes anarchist and otherwise radical books, and it's like entirely a DIY operation, and they print our books, and it's pretty amazing working with them. So I live in San Francisco, which has kind of been home to like this whole range of struggles over the past 3 years especially, and so a lot of what I'm going to say and the kind of argumentation I'll make is situated within that. So Nick, I apologize if the context is different here. I guess I want to first talk about the fact that for me this book was, in a large part, it was a cathartic project in that Bashback for me, and so the text and the theory anthologized here, the events that are described, is a thing that, like, for the better part of like 4 or 5 years of my life, like, was like my main project. It was something I engaged with. Like, a lot of my most intimate and personal relationships come out of it. A lot of repression that came down on like people I'm really close to came out of it. And so, writing this book for the last year has been an exercise in getting to like reflect on things that you know have been convenient to forget. And I want to emphasize this because I think that in a time period like ours, reflection and remembrance is really important. Specifically in the context, at least like on the West Coast, there's this huge social struggle unfolding, this anti-police struggle and anti-capitalist struggle. And so I think that like memory, reflection, and like catharsis in a way are like really important for those who engage in these types of struggles, because if we like just simply move quickly from like one issue to the next and one demonstration to the next and one occupation to the next without actually like reflecting on like the ways it affects us personally and the ways it affects like people around us, I think we're just totally doomed to make these same mistakes over and over again. And so I actually found that it was interesting to reflect on this past cycle of struggle for me as someone who's also engaging in like the anti-police struggles and the anti-capitalist struggle in the Bay Area currently, because it offers a lot of discrete lessons. And so a lot of my talk is going to be about that, and it's going to be about the kind of like dual nature of catharsis and reflection that like comes from memory. So that being said, I guess for me Bashback was a really personal project. I come from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, which was actually the town where Bashback started, and it was interesting because for me, I came to like, when I ran away from like my hometown and like moved to Milwaukee, like I got really involved with the anarchist culture there and like the different anarchist projects that were happening. But I kind of experienced my involvement with that as a huge lack of any analysis about gender, analysis about queerness. And I think in part it was because there's this kind of reactionary tendency that responds to the way that like theories of queerness and queer politics have been so like subsumed within the last 20 and 30 years with like not the nonprofit industrial complex, the academy, the left, and like the institutionalized left in general. And so I think there's a huge aversion among anarchist and anti-statist groups to like want to talk about these things. And so for me, Bashback was an important project to start because it opened up space within that for what I saw as being like a necessary intervention to like create space within already existing resistance struggles to talk about gender and to talk about sexuality and to talk about identity. And to me, it was just like, this was important because like part of my like process of radicalization was like experiencing the films of John Waters and like the novels of Jean Genet and the novels of James Baldwin and like kind of this like whole canon of work that starts from the position of like the excluded and the marginalized and like then comes up with this like really scathing critique of heteronormative, racialized, gendered society. And to me, any critique of capital and any critique of the world we live in has to start from the perspective of our like own lived experience. And so Bashback for me was an experiment in that and like a way to try to like begin a project that would correspond to such a critique. So yeah, like I said, I was involved with Bashback Milwaukee, which was one of the first chapters and also one of the first to formally break up, in part because of a lot of the contradictions and tensions that I'll get to later. Part of when I stopped being formally involved with Bashback was when I was named in a lawsuit that stemmed from an action at this place called Mount Hope Church, which is this like giant mega church in Michigan, which funds, among other things, like one of the largest anti-abortion campaigns in the country. It funds all these ex-gay camps. It funds these things called hell houses, where like teenagers go into them as if they think they're haunted houses, but then you see like people with AIDS and people having abortions rotting in hell. And so Mount Hope is this like really despicable institution, and also like happened to be a place where one of the members of Bashback Lansing had been forced to go to church their whole life, and so people had planned this disruption of a sermon there, which actually got a lot of attention. Bill O'Reilly described the action as like terrorism, and it was, people compared it to like U.S. soldiers getting massacred in Afghanistan, and like because people like went into this congregation and like threw condoms, and I mean it was pretty tame actually. But anyway, so I was listed in a lawsuit with that in 2009, and the result of that lawsuit is that I am formally banned, myself and all my co-defendants, we are formally banned from all places of worship in the United States by the federal government. So I guess they can do it. I can't go into any of them. So anyways, I guess like that's kind of like my formal involvement with Bashback, and like after leading that, I was involved with a lot of like the more theoretical projects that came out of it. But I want to talk about some experiences that happened in Milwaukee after Bashback ended. And I think these will illustrate for me like kind of the gravity that I would attach to this project and like why they're so important to me. Like one incident was like a summer night in 2009, and I was at home reading, which I often do on summer nights, and because I'm a bit of a recluse. And my partner at the time called and essentially said that there was what amounted to a lynch mob of frat boys chasing them and all of my friends around the east side of Milwaukee, which is kind of where all the frats are, and trying to kill them. Like, they were on motorcycles chasing them, and like, we're going to get you faggots. When we get you, we're going to kill you. And our immediate response, because in part of the types of relationships that were created through Bashback, was that by making a handful of phone calls immediately, we were able to mobilize cars, people, baseball bats, and like drive to this other part of town and like rescue our friends. And like ultimately nothing terrible happened from it. And to a huge extent, I think it's not necessarily because of the project of Bashback itself, but because of an ethic that came about through that project, wherein you take the dangers and traumas that the people you love face very seriously. And that like you take their word for it, and if they tell you I need help, then you believe them, and that you go to their aid as soon as possible, and that you like have resources at your disposal, you have knowledge at your disposal, and you have like a way of proceeding at your disposal which allows you to act. And so to me that's really important. And this played out actually again a year later when, interestingly enough, I had been living in San Francisco at the time, and Frey, the co-editor of the anthology, had come to San Francisco to visit me, and we were like having a meeting about it. And it just happened that like the night that we were having a meeting talking about this book, the Giants won the World Series and a sports riot unfolded. And never being ones to miss excitement, we went out there just for a stroll. And Frey and his partner were attacked by this gang of like bizarre hipster skater bros, which is a weird mix of people that only exist in the Bay. But anyways, so they were attacking Frey and his partner with U-locks, bottles. It was the two of them defending themselves against 8 people, and they were just like being totally like fucked up, and they were getting fucked up. And so when me and the people I was with realized what was happening, we intervened, and like, because again of like most of the people I was with were people who came out of the Bashback milieu, and so again we were prepared. Like, we just have a tendency of leaving the house with pepper spray and stun guns and like other implements to defend ourselves with, and because of that we were able to fight back these people who were trying to murder my best friend, and were able to like get my friend into a taxi, get them to the hospital. And so for me it's just like my engagement with Bashback is something that like, though the project has formally ended, the life project that accompanies it like continues, and that's the life project of just like being able to like forcibly assert like that you exist, and forcibly assert like a defense of the people you care about. The other instance I want to talk about also happened in Milwaukee, and this happened in May of 2010. A trans woman named Chanel Larkin, who is also a street-based sex worker in Milwaukee, got picked up by a John named Andrew Oligarsaru, which I'm not going to say his last name again because it's difficult. But anyway, so Chanel got picked up by this John named Andrew, and when she disclosed to him that she was trans, he told her to get out of the car, which she did, and then as soon as she got out of the car, he pulled a gun and shot her 3 times in the head, killing her. So, and this was a person who was like pretty well known in the queer community of Milwaukee. Like, she did all kinds of like really good work with street-based sex workers and was still a worker herself. And like this touched a lot of people, and people found out that this man Andrew lived in the neighborhood that happened to be where most of the like kind of queer people and anarchists in Milwaukee live, which is called River West. And so one night there was a show, a drag show, 2 nights after Chanel was murdered, that was for this like drag group in Milwaukee, and an anonymous flyer circulated calling for a Reclaim the Night march in her honor. And so like I wasn't involved with organizing things at this time, but like went to the march because it seemed like a really important thing to do. And the Reclaim the Night march crossed the bridge into the neighborhood, and then people in the march announced that people were going to the home of this man Andrew, who had murdered Chanel, and if people wanted to come, it was probably going to get a little intense, but people should join if they wanted to. And it made a turn, went up 3 blocks, at which point people lit about a dozen torches, went to the man's house, smashed out all the windows, threw the torches inside, and left. And as I was leaving the scene, I was like shocked at like how crazy that was, but also like felt this like kind of intense sense of empowerment. And people who I'd never met before were like, wow, I wonder if this was done by Bashback, which was interesting because Bashback didn't exist in Milwaukee and hadn't existed at that point for about 2 years. So to me, the events described in this book aren't limited to this book. Like they tap into this current within queer life, which is that like violence is a given. It exists. This is like the condition of our reality, and that the choices people have are like how to respond to that. And so I guess, yeah, I don't want people to read this historically. I want people to read this book like as something that they can annex into their own life experience, as something that like if they find themselves in it, then like they should use it. And like I think it would be wrong to see like the ideas and the tendencies described herein as being foreclosed or like closed off to a certain period of time, because they're not. And I actually think like I'll get into this more, but with the current crisis we're facing, I think like the issues, like I don't think it's getting better. I don't think it does get better. I think that people need to bash back. So I guess I'll get more to talking about the book now. Trying to write a story that's a comprehensive story about bashback is a really queer problem in and of itself, in that the bashback was never a determinate thing. At times it was like an activist group that had above ground meetings and people would join it. At times it was a name attached to communiques claiming clandestine actions against heterosexist institutions. At times it was dance parties, street parties, sex parties. At times it was like people squatting houses. At times it was like people's living situations. At times it was just like what people had to do in immediate moments in bars and on the streets just to survive. At times it was theory groups. And so like trying to tell one narrative is really difficult because it just isn't one narrative. And I like this problem because it touches on these problems of queer existence, which are that we can't simplify things into like one static form, and that like queerness as a problem itself like is something that's eternally problematizing how we understand categories. And so the book is structured in a way where we kind of do this almost facetiously structure it so that there's a section of communiques. Yeah.
Just real quick, when did Bashback exist?
It existed from 2007 and formally disbanded. It started in 2007 in Milwaukee. It formally disbanded in 2010 in Denver. But there are things included in here that go as far up as November of last year that were things done and published by the people who came out of that milieu. So the milieu that Bashback arose in still exists, but as a name it ended in 2010. There were about 20 Bashback chapters throughout the country. most of them centered in the Midwest, but also some in the Pacific Northwest and the East Bay of California, and a few in the Northeast. I'll get to a lot of that more, too. But, so I guess the book is structured, on the one hand, as communiques, which is a compilation of these texts that have been released claiming responsibility for actions, and then the second part of it is theory. And this, to an extent, this is a false dichotomy, as like there wasn't necessarily a distinction within Bashback between those who acted and those who theorized, and often the communiques are pretty theoretical, and the theory pieces are like kind of based in people's experiences. So it's a false dichotomy, but it really was kind of necessary for the sake of like shaping the book and like the type of writing that came out. Frey, who couldn't make it today, is actually the person who compiled the communiques, and so a lot of what I'm going to talk about is just going to be citing his work in this. But I think the communiques are really interesting because I think a communique as a form of expression is really important to our time period, where as like this struggle is unfolding and as like this crisis is deepening, and people are going to have to take more like dramatic action and like experiment with ways of surviving and resisting within capitalism, I think that the communique as a form is useful because it's a way of communicating our experiences, and if it's done right, it's a way of communicating the lessons learned from our experiments and our actions. And so I'm really excited that like in this book we have 250 pages of communiques. Again, there's problems with like trying to separate that from theory because I think they are theoretical. So I guess I'll just talk about how they're organized. The communiques are organized into 9 sections, the first of which is called Unconventional Queers, and this grouping of communiques deals with the context that Bashback like emerged from, which was a call to participate in the resistance against the Republican National Convention in 2008. And so starting in 2007, queers in the Midwest participated in the organizing against the conventions and planned like a series of queer blockades at the Republican National Convention, which would join this broader strategy where anarchists and anti-capitalists were planning to make blockades to shut down the Republican Convention. This section is really interesting in a lot of ways. It deals with kind of some of the problems that came with the emergence of Bashback. An interesting anecdote is that in the Spokes Council the night before the Republican Convention protests, where all the people who came there to resist were having a huge meeting, and one of the main organizers of the RNC Welcoming Committee, which was the main, primarily straight anarchist group in Minneapolis at the time, talked about how it was maybe important to make some distinctions between the hard barricades, the hetero barricades, and then the fluffy ones like the Bashback barricade, which was interesting because the posters for that were promoting that blockade were all just like pictures of queer people burning cop cars in San Francisco. But gay people aren't violent, and gay people like don't resist militantly, so it's fluffy. So this was an interesting time period because it really was this group of people who had gone unrecognized within like militant resistance circles, especially at the time period, like intentionally creating a space to participate in those things. So yeah, that I actually think this section is less important because it was really like just how things began, and I want to get to some of the other ones instead. The next section is called Forging a Praxis of Vengeance, and I guess like if anyone is going to read only one section of this book, I would really want them to read the communiques in this section because they deal with some of the most intense actions that happened from Bashback, or at least the communiques claiming actions. There's a communique from someone in Bashback Lansing talking about being attacked in a bar and how their crew fought back against their attacker. There's discussions of the Oscar Grant riots in California and people's experiences of that. There's talk about different attacks against racist, heterosexist police institutions. I think it's really important, I think I could theorize for a long time about the concept of vengeance because I think it's under-theorized, but instead I'm just going to read a communique that's on the longer side from this section that was actually published after Bashback stopped existing, but was circulated through the kind of like infrastructure that existed that came out of Bashback. November 13th, 2011, Chicago. Police cars attacked as vengeance for Shelley Hilliard. In the wee hours of the morning of November 13th, a banner was dropped on a bridge over the I-90-94 in Chicago reading, "Don't mourn, attack, avenge Shelley." and 3 police vehicles were disabled in response to the brutal murder of a young trans woman named Shelley Treasure Hilliard, whose torso was found next to the same highway, I-94, in Detroit this past week. It is easy to become lost in the sorrow of the brutal violence of gender that exposes the bodies of trans women to a 1 in 12 chance of violent death at the hands of the partisans defending this wretched society. But our violence is the alchemy that can tear into a potent poison dripping down the throats of the social order. Take action to avenge Shelley's death and to remind us all that in the face of terror of prisons, police, and queer bashings, that it is our obligation to bash back against all that would destroy us. We look forward to hearing more about more attacks for Shelley and for all of us in the coming weeks. Solidarity to all the trans women and gender rebels surviving in the belly of the prison and under the guns of the pigs. Solidarity to the comrades in the U.S., Mexico, Greece, Chile, and many other places that have chosen to attack now and face the violence of the law. Solidarity with those whose survival has been made criminal and who are reclaiming their ability to struggle. Yours in the gender strike, some ticked-off trannies with knives. And then this communique was responded to a week later with another communique from the Pacific Northwest, claiming another series of attacks in solidarity with and in vengeance for trans women who had been murdered or otherwise oppressed this year in the U.S. And this communique is kind of triggering, so just a warning. It's called From Tea Lights to Torches, Delinquent Alternatives to the Transgender Day of Remembrance and the Trans Attacks to Come. As thousands of people in cities all across the world gathered on November 20th to memorialize the 23 transgender women that were murdered in the past year, some of us decided to skip the opportunity of silently listening to the politicians of the trans community recite the names of the dead over candlelight, romantic as it sounded. Instead, we ventured into the mist and fog of a Northwest autumn night and made several attacks as small gestures of antagonism towards the state, the bashers, and the leftists who used the blood of trans women to build campaigns for hate crime legislation and reform. We are against hate crime legislation because we are against prisons, against the infuriating portrayal of police as protectors, against rising for their judges in their detestable courtrooms, against, though not surprised in the least by, the way that such legislation is used to defend those in positions of power, and because we are, at heart, hate-filled criminal enemies of this society. By the end of the night, several surfaces and institutions that we hate have been subject to vandalism by the trans symbol. Too many deaths, not enough dead pigs, and 20 feet of silver letters across a darkly painted business rooftop reading Vengeance for Shelley Hilliard, Circle A, Bash Back. Shelley Hilliard, also known as Treasure, was a 19-year-old trans woman from Detroit who was identified by a tattoo earlier this month after her burned torso was found on the side of the highway. Chrissy Bates was found stabbed to death in her Minneapolis apartment in January in a brutal murder that was described in the newspapers as overkill. Tyra Trent was strangled to death in her Baltimore apartment in February. Miss Nate Eugene Davis was shot and left behind a Houston dumpster in June. Lachey McLean was shot in the street in Washington, D.C. in July. Camilla Guzman was stabbed to death by a John in New York City in August. Gaurav Gopalan died from trauma to the head in September, and Chastity Vickers was shot in Hollywood just 4 days ago on November 16th. These are just a few examples of transsexual homicides in the U.S. Alone that made headlines this year. Women whose lives and death get summed up by reporter after snake-eyed reporter who can barely manage to contain their contempt for the queer and make no effort whatsoever to disguise their disdain for anyone alleged to have been a criminal or a whore. Funeral services become the rushed lowering of mangled corpses into the ground in anticipation of a grave on which to spit. This was exemplified by the pastor at Lachey McLean's funeral, who repeatedly referred to her by male pronouns and went as far as to incite a mass walkout of the many trans attendants by claiming that, quote, when you live a certain lifestyle, this is the consequence you have to pay, end quote. While we remember our dead, let us not forget about those still struggling, especially those who are facing charges and are living lives in cages. In June, Catherine Carlson was sentenced to 10 years in an Idaho prison after being convicted of first-degree arson, unlawful possession of a bomb, using a hoax destructive device, and indecent exposure. Before her conviction, she had locked herself in her trailer for years and left only when necessary, approximately once every 10 days, when she needed food and could no longer subsist off coffee alone. Every time she left her home, she was taunted by the police. Despite having her name legally changed for over 3 decades, she couldn't get her given name removed from her license. She was jailed on 4 occasions for driving without a license, in her stubborn and inspiring refusal to acknowledge the state's attempts at controlling her gender. Eventually, this torment led to rupture. Catherine constructed what appeared to be 4 pipe bombs, left them next to propane tanks, set her trailer and her truck on fire, and walked down the highway naked until being stopped and arrested. She is currently being held in the whole of a men's prison despite having had sex reassignment surgery. On the night of June 5th in Minneapolis, Krishan C.C. McDonald was harassed outside of a bar for being black and trans and had a glass smashed in her face by a neo-Nazi named Dean Schmitz. A fight broke out, and minutes later, her attacker, Dean Schmitz, had been fatally stabbed. C.C. was arrested, charged with murder, got bailed out after a month in isolation, and is currently awaiting trial. 3 trans women were arrested in connection to a flash mob attack on a New York City Dunkin' Donuts that happened on Christopher Street on the night of May 16th. Christopher Street has a rich history of queer and trans resistance, including the Stonewall riots, and an apparent inability to rid itself of the fierce homeless trans youth it is known for despite decades of gentrification and quality of life campaigns. During the flash mob, 24 transgender youth stormed the shop, threw chairs, destroyed expensive coffee machines, and looted goods. Those arrested have been charged with assault, criminal mischief, menacing, rioting, and criminal possession of a weapon. In August, off-duty police officer Kenneth Furr took it upon himself to remind us that police are the absolute enemy. He became angry when 3 trans women in D.C. refused complicity in his entitled assumption that his pig salary could buy any trans body he encountered on the street. So angry, in fact, that he climbed onto the roof of the car and shot the passengers inside. One woman was grazed by a bullet, one was shot in the hand, and the brother of one of the women was shot in the chest. The cops were kind enough to show up and escort the injured individuals to the hospital in handcuffs. A few days ago, Brooke Fantinelli was repeatedly tased in El Central, California by a Bureau of Land Management ranger. Brooke was stopped for public intoxication while taking pictures in the desert. After being ID'd by the police officer, he told her, quote, "You used to be a guy," and then tased her with her hands up. Once she was on the ground, he tased her again, this time in the genitals. Also this month, Andrea Jones was arrested for indecent exposure, or more accurately, for exposing the legal system as the brutally illogical apparatus of control that it is. Andrea went topless in a Tennessee DMV after they refused to change the gender on her ID to female. As a male, she said, she had the legal right to take off her shirt. She was jailed for 3 weeks, lost her job, and will most likely have to register as a sex offender. As usual, the cops and the COs are free to rape us and expose us to sexual violence, meanwhile charging those they take hostage as sex offenders. Those most vulnerable to this tactic of the state are the gender-variant queer inmates and black men who are demonized in the racist smear campaigns by the media as rapists every time a cop is murdered. Finally, we want to mention Amazon, a transsexual lesbian who has been in prison for the past 30 years and is serving life in California. In a letter that was published in the recent Pink and Black newsletter, she said, quote, "I am from the Gender Anarchy Collective in the prisons. We are a militant organization fighting for transsexual medicine in the form of female hormones and sex-corrective surgery, and against all forms of hate, genocide, and discrimination by the cops and prisoners alike, and are also a self-defense structure and will fight, have fought, and are fighting for hours on the yards. I am currently in the hole for, quote, battery on an inmate with a weapon. 2 other girls are in here with me, one for 3 counts of assault on a staff who jumped her. We survived by aggressive self-defense," end quote. She then proceeds to denounce activism and engagement in politics, describing instead the necessary, quote, post-apocalyptic Civil War madness that must ensue, and the myth that social peace works desperately to keep from us. Quote, "Prison is government. No government in the world is going to allow anyone to deconstruct its prisons, come what may. Therefore, to abolish prisons, the government must be destroyed and overthrown," end quote. Here's to the end of the capitalist system and the police that imprison us to protect, and here's to freedom for trans women and freedom for us all. As our hearts burn with the losses of our loved ones, may their cities burn as well. Dean Schmitz was not the first, and he will not be the last. Vengeance, not remembrance. We will not rest in peace. And so I guess if people want to talk about vengeance as a theoretical and political praxis, I want to talk about it a lot. But for now, I'm just going to let that marinate and move on. The next section of Communiques is called Dispatches from the War Against God, which mainly cites a series of attacks against fundamentalist and Mormon churches in the United States, primarily in the Pacific Northwest. It also talks about the action that led to the lawsuit that got me banned from all of the churches in America. After that is a section called Rejuvenating the Struggle against Assimilation, which details a series of attacks against transphobic, statist, and otherwise right-wing assimilationist queer groups such as the HRC. I feel like most radical queer politics ends up only being about assimilation, and this is kind of a critique that I don't necessarily feel like I need to elaborate that much, but if you want to talk about it, I would love to. The next section, there's a section called the 2009 Bashback Convergence in Chicago and Subsequent Drama, which, if Frey were here, he would read at length because he is kind of a drama queen, but I'm going to skip for now just as I have a lot to cover with him being gone. Another section I think is really important is a section called Communiques from Various G20 Riots. This section talks specifically about 2 meetings of the Group of 20. Is everyone here familiar with the G20? So, yeah, the G20 is just it's like the leaders of the 20 most powerful nations in the world who meet several times a year in order to plan their continued neoliberal domination of the world. And anyways, after the financial crisis began to unfold towards the end of 2008, they called for an emergency summit in Pittsburgh to happen in September. And at this summit, hosted by Barack Obama, it was going to be all the G20 members coming together and laying out a strategy of what they called restructuring or austerity. And basically, all of the revolts that we're seeing across the world right now are in response to the economic and government policies planned at this meeting in September. And so a call went out for anti-capitalists to descend in Pittsburgh in September of 2009 and wreck the parties of the world leaders. And a march was called specifically by Bashback Pittsburgh as a march for international queer liberation, which took place after a queer variety show where Annie Danger gave an interesting PowerPoint presentation about the history of queer riots. And afterwards, people planned this queer demonstration, and which actually turned out to be, of a whole week of rioting at the G20, was the most kind of destructive, chaotic event of the entire week. And so I want to read a little bit from the part that Freyo wrote about kind of this concept of queer riots, which obviously has an important historical place. Like the entire queer liberation movement comes out of we're fed this narrative about these series of riots that comes out of Stonewall, Compton's, Dewey's, White Knight. And so I kind of want to situate this because basically since the AB 101 riots in the early 90s in California, this was the largest queer riot that happened in my lifetime and probably in a lot of the lifetimes of people in this room. And so it's funny that it's actually was almost entirely not covered, and very few people know about it. And so the section and the communiques that deal with it are really important, and they kind of also touch on a few very important theoretical points about the role of identity and struggle, the role of queerness, if it can be affirmed or if it must exist as a negation. So I'm just going to read what Frey wrote about riots. It starts with a quote from one of the communiques in the book. Fairy wands, tiaras, hammers, and masks were annexed into our limbs as dangerous prosthetics. Rocks, dumpsters, and black sequin dresses were profaned and put into use, thrown through windows, set on fire, and draped over our shoulders as a more fabulous take on riot attire. Our thresholds of self dissolved further into a flood of shattered glass and smoldering garbage across the field of play. Then he begins. To be queer is to defy the laws placed on our body by the state, the church, and all authority. In breaking these laws, we demonstrate that our bodies are our own and belong to nothing or to no one else. This criminality marvelously extends itself into the queer riot. The intentions of the queer riot are to collectively destroy the property of those who use authority against the oppressed, and to become empowered in the process. It can be of the few or it can be of the masses, but in either instance, the queer riot is a beautiful painting of the reality that our bodies, especially in riot, are indeed uncontrollable. It is true that a riot is not accessible to all bodies, but within Bashback, several attempts were made to create space for all people, despite their societal marginalization, to express their rage in such riotous manner. A conscious effort was made by fellow queers to assist those who took larger risks in the queer riot. In the streets, comrades were pushed along in wheelchairs. Those without the ability to hear, or those with the ability to hear, made sure that queers who were hard of hearing had clear lines of communications. Rioters did not judge those who were unable to participate in the physical manifestations. This is not to say that the queer riots were not flawed or that the Bashback riots were completely inclusive. Rather, we acknowledge that the separation that the state and the left recommend in regards to the type of people who can safely participate in militant struggle is and was taken as the object of the queer riots. The practice of this tendency is that people who are oppressed due to race, gender, body type, immigration status, occupation, or most other prescribed or chosen marginalized identities or conditions have the strongest desires and the strongest interests in seeing society fall, and therefore are quicker to take confrontational roles in the elimination of capitalism. Those who engaged with the Bashback tendencies were witness to, and in some case took part in, riotous events when Bart Kopp Johannes Messerly gunned down Oscar Grant in the cold blood. radical queers were in the streets of Oakland and raising hell. In reference to the rowdy protests of the RNC, the Bashback contingent in Chicago's Matthew Shepard March chanted, "We'll smash your windows," just like in St. Paul. Bashback, the tendency, the whatever, the organization, formed just prior to the latest global economic crises as the wealth of nations disappeared. The group of 8, comprised of the 8 most wealthy nations, was overshadowed by the group of 20, made up of the 20 most wealthy nations in the world. Anti-capitalist radicals began to place more focus on G20 summits and the crisis of capitalism. Some of the largest actions taken by Bashback, with its hard anti-capitalist stance, centered around the resistance to global capitalism, specifically at the G20 summits. As part of the anti-capitalist demonstration against the G20 summit in Pittsburgh, Bashback led a violent riot in a notorious racist, misogynist, and anti-queer college neighborhood called Oakland, Pittsburgh. And actually, it's really funny that this riot happened in this neighborhood because radicals and queers in Pittsburgh have hated this neighborhood for years. It's kind of like this absolute cesspool of like racism, heterosexism, and just like, it's just despicable. Every single branch of the military has a recruiting office there. Carnegie Mellon's offices there develop weapons guidance systems that like lead drones to like slaughter innocent people in Afghanistan. Queer bashings happen almost every day there. It's home to every frat in the city. One of the most popular bars on the campus has this racist, that's owned by an open white supremacist, has this racist event every Wednesday called Wetback Wednesdays where they sell tacos for really cheap. It's just a despicable place home to all sorts of like racism, militarism, and just downright tackiness. And it's important to contextualize that like this is the neighborhood where that riot unfolded, and like those specific institutions, like a university police station, Carnegie Mellon labs, the military recruitment offices, every corporation in the city that has a store there, like were just totally decimated in this like insanely like destructive sequence that was part of a larger day of revolt. It's also important, and I think there's an interesting theoretical point that we can learn here, which is that while this was unfolding, some of the frat boys who lived in that neighborhood started calling the participants in the demonstration faggots, and was like, "Fuck you, faggots." Which is, I mean, you have to give them some credit. It was bold, considering it was a bunch of people wearing masks and holding hammers, chanting, "We're here, we're queer, we're gonna fuck you up." But so it was daring on the part of these would-be queer bashers. But needless to say, like, they were maced, attacked. Their attacks were rebutted. And so I think, to me, it like perfectly illustrates this point that's like continuous throughout Bashback, where you have like the personal and the political like rapidly oscillating and kind of like inverting, and like things go from being like, you know, very abstract to being very real, like in a matter of moments. And I don't know, I think a lot of the communiques in this section are really important. I would encourage people to read them. After that is a section called Building a Radical Queer, or a Criminal Queer Culture, which focuses on some of the more cultural aspects of Bashback. It talks about some spaces that existed. In Chicago, there was a collective space called the Cunt Collective, which was a queer feminist space that was like associated with Bashback and like hosted all sorts of events and was like really important to the anarchist scene there. In Memphis, people opened a squat called the Marsha P. Johnson Center, which served as a squatted social center where runaway queer youth could live for free without having to like give over their information to the various like systems that kind of like dictate such infrastructure otherwise. In Chicago, a series of parties were thrown called Glamour Queer Sextravaganzas, which were always fundraisers for queer projects and queer prisoners. Oftentimes these parties would be broken up by the police. Oftentimes police cars would be disabled in the process. In Seattle, there's a yearly event that happens around Pride that's an anti-corporate Pride event called Queers Fucking Queers, which is a street party that almost universally turns into a riot. So these things are kind of talked about in here. I'll encourage you to read them. The second to last section is called Aerial Attack Goes to Court, and this is really important because it deals with the court case of a person named Ariel Attack, who helped a lot with this book also and is like great and one of the most brilliant people I know. And she is a transgender anarchist who was living in Denver at the time and was arrested for smashing out the windows of the Democratic Party headquarters at a time when they were complicit in this like really transphobic legislation that was being passed. And so she smashed out all these windows. Another person allegedly did it too, but escaped. Ariel was arrested, refused to snitch on the person, refused to give the name over to the police. And anyways, we wanted to emphasize her court strategy because it's really interesting, and that she used her queerness as a weapon against the judicial system. Rather than trying to proclaim innocence, rather than trying to mask her actions, and I say her actions because she pled guilty, so we can talk about the fact that she actually did do it, but she made a huge spectacle of her court case, and she, her support material were all pictures of her holding hammers that said "Hammer Time." There was a anarchist fashion blog in Denver, which every time she had a court appearance would do a new court outfit for her that emphasized gender fuckery and villainy, and just kind of emphasized her as this kind of queer anarchist supervillain. And basically every time she would go to court, it was such a disruptive, kind of crazy spectacle that the DA ultimately, rather than wanting to take it to court, just gave her a really good deal where she didn't have to serve any jail time. Also in this section, we talk about another person who faced repression through because of their involvement with Bashback, a person named David Japanga, who was arrested at the riots I just described in the previous section. He was the only person arrested during those riots, and thus they pretty much threw the book at him. But he again took an uncompromising court strategy. He refused to name names. He refused to cooperate with the state, and as such, served much less time than he would have if he was less defiant. People also whenever he would have a court date, people in other parts of Pittsburgh would carry out attacks against state infrastructure and bank infrastructure, kind of emphasizing that if people continue to fuck with David, that there would be repercussions for the state apparatuses, and this kind of helped in putting pressure on the DA to drop the charges. So the last section is called Callouts and Random Shit That You Should Read Anyways, which I guess speaks for itself. So I guess I kind of rushed through some of that because that's not the section that I compiled. My work in here was to compile the theory of the book, which comprises the subsequent 150 pages. And I guess I want to start with a caveat, which is that by theory, I do not mean the Academy. I'll read this. This is from a section called The Real Antisocial Turn in Queer Theory. And it starts with a quote from Guy Debord in Society of the Spectacle. 123. The Proletarian Revolution is predicated entirely on the requirement that, for the first time, theory as the understanding of human practice be recognized and directly lived by the masses. This revolution demands that workers become dialecticians and inscribe their thought upon practice. It thus asks much more of its men without qualities than the bourgeois revolution ever asked of those men with qualifications that it enlisted to run things. It is thus the very evolution of class society into the spectacular organization of non-life that obliges the revolutionary project to become visibly what it always was in essence. 124. Revolutionary theory is now the sworn enemy of all revolutionary ideology, and it knows it. End quote. Those who keep up with current academic queer theory will surely be aware of the self-described antisocial turn in queer theory. It seems that the newest trend within the Queer Academy is to focus on queer negativity, to critique society, and to refuse traditional politics. At a time when society itself is falling apart, when unprecedented amounts of human beings are recognizing that they too have no future and are proceeding accordingly, we must call this academic trend by its nature, recuperation. Some moron tries basing his thesis on the queer riots at the G20. Judith Butler delivers a speech at a conference at the New School about queer anarchism, yet mentions nothing about the practice of queer anarchists. Jack Halberstam seeks to valorize the negative and trace the antisocial turn, yet only ever talks about Pixar films. A class at the University of California is called Criminal Queer, and yet the instructor denounces the activities of queer criminals on that very campus. One after another, queer academics line up to jump on the negativity bandwagon. Each appropriates the activity of insurgents towards the ends of strengthening their own careers. They take antisocial activity and use it to reproduce the academy as a central engine of society itself. This is the ultimate treason. In theorizing about the activity of Bashback, it is my ambition to demonstrate real queer assaults upon the social order. In doing so, this collection should clearly expose those for whom negativity and revolt are mere matters of image. The queer insurrection demands that each of us become a theoretician, but more importantly, it demands that the antisocial turn, the turn against society, remain in the streets. Our revolt and our theory must be inseparable from our daily life. Towards this end, Bashback can be read as an attempt to expropriate queer theory from the academy and put it toward the service of queer revolt, to dynamite the distinction between theory and life. For the sake of organizing this book, we split the text between essays and communiques, but to a large extent this is a false dichotomy that doesn't accurately describe the activity of Bashback, which can never fully recognize the distinction between its theorists and its combatants. Rather, it sought to queer this distinction and offer a praxis wherein theory is embodied in the very activity of those who theorize. A book that declares no future offers only words, yet a riot or series of actions that declare the same demonstrates a step towards an insurgency. So, with that caveat, I want to begin by talking about like how we imagine theory and the type of bodies that theory comes out of. The theory section is and the essays within it, and then interviews are organized based on theory collectives and underground theory groups that published things through like clandestine channels, but like weren't formally engaged within the academy. These groups include a group that was called a Gang of Criminal Queers based out of Milwaukee, Wisconsin, which published texts such as Towards the Queer's Insurrection and Towards the Queer's Insurrection, a text called Horror Theory, another text called What Is It to Become Beautiful. These texts were only really circulated in zine format, and like some of them were relatively popular, but others were kind of unpublished until this book was put together. There's a group called Gender Mutiny, which kind of described itself as nihilist queer theory, and published a text called Chronology of Genderfuck Insurrection, and also published a text called Preliminary Notes on Modes of Reproduction that really get into this idea of like identity and how it corresponds to revolt. There's a group called Not Your Sister Press, which emerged out of Bashback Chicago, and they do what they call insurrectionary transfeminist theory, focusing mostly as a critique of a kind of resurgent second wave feminism that existed within anarchist milieux at the time. There's a journal called Pink and Black Attack, which was circulated out of the Pacific Northwest, which was kind of a news periodical that also had some theoretical debate, mostly having to do with the Bashback milieu. There was a group called Politics Not a Banana, or a publication called Politics Not a Banana by a group called the Institute for Experimental Freedom, which we take some from. And then there's some things which were just totally anonymous and were never associated with the full group. All of the groups that are named, I conducted interviews with, and those interviews are included here, and so those projects kind of speak for themselves. More of what I want to speak to are the theoretical questions that I use as a rubric when picking text to be included in the book. I guess I'll talk about some of those questions now. The first question is really the question of organization and what it means to actually like find one another and engage in a project together. And as I kind of articulated earlier, Bashback was this really queer form of organization in that sometimes it was a network, at other times it was a milieu, at times it was a social grouping, at times it was parties, at times it was riots, at times it was whoever used the name. And so we try to trace these different modes of organizing and show the successes and the failures of each one. And I think this is really important, especially in the context we're in now, where there's this unfolding social movement, specifically the Occupy movement, which probably will give way to other things. But I think it's useful to actually like reflect critically on the types of organization that we engage with. And specifically in the Bay Area, we're having this problem right now where over the past few years there have been these huge explosions of riotous and subversive activity, first with the Oscar Grant Rebellion, then with the California student movement, and then with the now this kind of like Occupy Oakland phenomena. And the problem is that you have these explosions or these ruptures where like really radical things happen, things that previously seemed impossible become possible, people make intense new relationships, people are changed through the process of their activity, and yet the organizational structures that people create to try to capture and like sustain these things fail universally. The Oscar Grant Coalition failed to continue the Oscar Grant Rebellion. The existence of Occupy Oakland as a formal body has failed to exist. The student groups that came out of the student movement all kind of devolved into the worst type of like sectarian nonsense. And so I think part of the project that I'm excited about, especially in criticizing the organizational forms within Bashback, are trying to locate the explosive and the subversive potential within certain forms, but then figuring out how to extend that potential, but being open-minded enough to discard of the forms when they're dead. And I think like what's happening right now across the country is that you have a lot of people who are energized through this Occupy movement and are realizing maybe the limitations of a lot of the forms that came with that. And so I'm excited about this section because it really like gets into this idea of like what it means to like have your project be a project that's part of your life and that's sustainable and that is lifelong, but that is capable of like outliving the death of projects in the way that I think Bashing Back has outlived Bashback. The second question that the book deals with is this question of violence, and to a huge extent I'll make an argument throughout the book that there wasn't a question of violence and that for those who started the project, violence was a given, and the only question was how one responded to it. This has actually become it was actually refreshing to reread the text in this book at a time when this Occupy movement was unfolding, specifically because of the really mystified and confused ideas that come with it, ideas that ignore entire histories of resistance, specifically queer resistance, that promote these certain mythologies about anti-colonial struggle and like how they actually happen, that really emphasize, for example, that anyone who steps outside of like a totally passive role is being violent, and yet at the same time, when police officers on the UC Berkeley campus beat people with batons or attack people with pepper spray. I'm sure you're all familiar with the pepper spray cop meme. But when the police are violent, those in power will describe this as not violence, whereas when people resist, it's always described as violence. The chancellor of the University of California actually went so far as to say that it was not violent for police officers to beat students because they were doing their job, but it was violent for those students to link arms and try to protect one another from being beaten with batons because they were disobeying, and disobedience is fundamentally violence. And so when I say that there's not a question of violence in the book, it's actually kind of a way of stepping around the question of violence. I would contend that the discourse of violence is always wrapped up in power relations, and that those in power will always describe the activities of those who resist as violent, whether those activities harm the body of another or not. And so I think, to an extent, the discourse is a bit silly, and like will always kind of like plays this game of defining what is violent, what is not violent. But really, the questions that we need to be asking are: what is effective? What helps us to survive? What helps us to protect one another? What helps us to wage a campaign of vengeance against the institutions that immiserate us? And so, I don't know. I'm down to talk about violence, but I also kind of, to me, it's not as contentious as a topic, and so I'm going to move on. The third question that I really try to address is the question of identity and the role of identity within struggle, specifically queer identity in queer struggle. I'm just going to read, actually. It's a book talk, so I can read. The section's called Identity Crisis. As mentioned in the above section, after certain circles within Bashback had thoroughly rid themselves of liberal pacifist tendencies, future conflict was staged between militants or insurrectionists who differed in regard to the question of identity. Though the above conflicts over violence often played out in ways that were parallel to the discussions of identity, I'll concern myself here with those discussions of identity that take violence as a given. This will serve to illuminate a set of questions and conflicts that emerged as unique to Bashback. A way to view this conflict is to understand the partisans as, on the one hand, militants of identity politics, and on the other, anti-identitarians. One side takes identity as a given and a precondition that must shape our organizing and struggle. The other locates identity as the enemy itself. Positions within this conflict were not stable. Individuals and groups within the Bashback tendency could embody either of these positions or both at once. I'm going to avoid a lot of the specifics of these conflicts, as many of them need to remain abstract, and others are not my stories to tell. Rather, I'll focus on the theoretical grounding of this confrontation, and we'll leave space for those who experienced it to locate themselves within this reading. This problem, the problem of identity, within Bashback, is quite fitting, insofar as it is a queer problem. Queerness itself is a contested territory, open to endless debate and critique. For a certain camp of people, queerness is a positive project, with its own set of norms and communities. For others, queerness can only be conceived of negatively, as that which fails or exceeds any set of norm laid down by any community. In this way, queer comes to be a catachresis, or a name wrongly given to that which cannot be named, a label given to that which cannot be labeled. Positions within Bashback took their starting point from any number of positions within this complex theoretical matrix. There is an argument to be made that one's position on the debate was often directly descendant from one's own political or anti-political background. Those who came to Bashback from gender studies tended to conduct themselves as the militant shock troops of whatever doctrine they picked up from their professors. Those enmeshed within anarchist circles tended to have a strong, if at times perhaps too harsh, aversion to identity-based analysis and struggle, focusing instead on locating points of conflict within identity itself. Those who came from established queer scenes brought with them a whole range of expectations in regard to people's behaviors and language, expectations that were often alien to those not familiar with such cliques. What is so queer about the set of conflicts at play within Bashback is that each of these positions was permeated with the other, and a wide array of perversions emerged. I'd like to offer a certain synthesis that emerged out of many of these conflicts that could prove beneficial for anarchists and other rebels in coming struggles. That means experience must be the basis of struggle. If we expect to engage in a material struggle against the capitalist social order, we must begin from the ways in which we experience that order ourselves. This means that those who share a set of experiences under capitalism will have a natural head start in forging alliances against society. This is the kernel of truth at the heart of identity politics, and yet sadly this kernel is obscured through layer upon layer of abstraction and mystification produced by identity politics and the nonprofit industrial complex. Any effort to build autonomous power based on one's position within and against society must begin by disillusioning itself of the baggage of identity politics. So here's a quick sketch of certain anti-identity politics that I distilled from the communiques and the theory anthologized here. 1. Identity politics are always based on a flattening out of experience, making the critique of society abstract rather than lived. 2. Identity politics promotes cross-class alliances, thus offering those with more power, and thus an interest in the proliferation of those power relations, to silence the most marginalized within those alliances. 3. Identity politics are rooted in the ideology of victimization, and thus celebrate and come to enforce the norms surrounding what activity people are allowed to or able to participate in. This plays out by reinforcing certain mythology about struggle. Example, the black bloc is only comprised of cis white men, or oppressed people are incapable of certain strategies of revolt. 4. Identity politics are always based on the fallacy of coherent communities. Some French people somewhere once said that, quote, there are greater ethical differences within communities than between them. That is to say that those trapped within certain communities or identity structures often have less in common with one another than they do with those who they are purported to be opposed to. This fallacy thrives on abstraction of experience rather than an analysis of lived experience itself. A queer person in prison has more in common with their straight cellmate than with some scumbag gay senator, and yet the mythology of the queer community serves to suffocate enemies of society and subjugate them to their self-appointed representatives. 6. Identity politics are fundamentally reformist and seek to find a more favorable relationship between different subject positions rather than to abolish the structures that produce those positions from the beginning. Identity politicians oppose classism while being content to leave class society intact. Any resistance to society must foreground the destruction of the subjectifying processes which reproduce society daily, and must destroy the institutions and practices that racialize and engender bodies within the social order. And lastly, identity politics are deployed by, inherently refer to, always valorize, and are in and of themselves the state. So taking this analysis to heart, Bashback could be seen as an attempt to forge a resistance practice of lived experience outside the logic of identity politics. Though not authored by participants in Bashback, I'll include a section from a text by anarcho-feminists in San Francisco entitled, quote, Anarcho-Feminists Take to the Streets. This piece, published concurrently with the identity crisis of Bashback, offers an outstanding and unique way to conceptualize patriarchy and resistance to it. To quote, ironically, despite our critiques and sometimes hatreds of identity politics, we find ourselves coming together around a somewhat loose identity. We are some people who no longer want to be victims of gender tyranny and misogyny. Within this grouping, we are hoping to circumvent, to a certain extent, our gender and what that means for us when we are living our lives in this man's world, so that we might gain some insight as to what it might look like to not have gender dynamics influence every interaction. We come together to fight for a reality where the identities of man, woman, and trans are logical impossibilities. I'll follow the authors of the anarcho-feminist communique as they understand themselves to be unified in their desires and dispositions rather than their identities. Without reference to a shared or stable subject, the authors of this piece offer a starting point for the construction of an anti-essentialist, anti-identitarian force to combat patriarchy. In the context of the reemergence of second-wave feminism within insurrectionary anarchist and communist circles, this way of thinking is quite beautiful and refreshing. It offers a roadmap to how we might build the type of war machine that can destroy gender. This is why I do not conceive of Bashback as being rooted in queer identity, but rather I understand it to be an experiment in building an offensive constellation of queer positions. We are the people who aim to destroy the social order from which we've been excluded. We are the people seeking to end our imprisonment. We are the people who hate gendered capitalism and heteronormativity. Our position is hyper-attuned to our lived experiences. Our understanding of ourselves and our position names our enemies in and of itself. And so while outsider perspectives may only be able to understand Bashback through the logic of identity, I understand it as a series of experiments towards identity's undoing. In the same way that the Oscar Grant riots in Oakland, California created unlikely alliances against the racial order, so too did Bashback result in a sequence of material attacks against all the subject positions within the heteronormative identity matrix. Many who began their engagement with the project found themselves seduced by its way of war. Straight comrades found themselves destroying gender alongside gender freaks of all stripes. Many even found themselves unburdened of their previous subjective attachment to straightness. Queers and all those assigned victim at birth engage in a practice of refusing victimization, and in doing so refuse the foundational principle of their role in this gendered society. Insurrectionary theory tells us that an insurrectionary process is based on attack and experimentation to open up a way towards society's undoing. Queer theory tells us that queering is a verb, a process which eternally problematizes and undoes normative roles. I'll locate Bashback at the intersection of these processes and understand them to be one and the same. So I guess that's a lot of words to really just say that I think that, like, talking about identity can't be a simple point. Like, it has to be something that we understand and have the most on-point analysis of if we're going to engage in struggle. Where I live in the Bay Area is, to me, the biggest example of how state-oriented identity politics are the absolute enemy of resistance struggles. Some good examples would be that SFPD, which murders people all the time, including most recently a person named Kenneth Harding, is constantly shooting people, is constantly attacking sex workers, is constantly imprisoning queer people, is constantly imprisoning people of color. SFPD recently released an It Gets Better video, along with all the other politicians and celebrities who did so. And in it, each of the officers talks about their coming out story. They talk about how horrible it was to grow up queer, wherever they were from. And then they talk about how they came out, and now their lives are perfect. And they're police officers, and they never thought that they would be able to be police officers. But now, they get to be, and everyone loves them, and they have wonderful lives. And they're paid hundreds of thousands of dollars a year in overtime to shoot and murder brown people in the Bay Area. And in it, they urge people to, to just keep going, that it gets better, and that if it doesn't get better, and until it gets better, you can call the police, and they'll be there to help you. And so to me, this is like a really poignant example of the kind of recuperative capacity of identity politics. Another example would be the way in which rebels in California, specifically black people in California who revolted against the police after the murder of Oscar Grant, were described by the state, specifically by the city council and also by the police department, as being fucked up privileged white people. The media, for example, would talk about these privileged white people engaging in riots, and then would show pictures of black people like resisting the police and smashing windows and looting. And so it's a way in which the identity politics becomes a way in which the resistance of oppressed people it becomes a way of erasing their resistance, of obscuring their resistance, and ultimately of putting it down. In Oakland, for example, some of the biggest people who have been trying to stop the more revolutionary elements of the Oscar Grant riots, of the student movement, and now of the Occupy movement, is a coalition that literally calls itself the Vanguard, which is a group of identity-based nonprofits that literally, like, we know this because like people go to their meetings. They have meetings where representatives from all of the nonprofits come together and talk about how they can take over, like literally in their words, take over these social movements, and how they can gain control of them and make them into recruitment drives for their nonprofits and make them into things that they can use to get more funding. And their strategy is to do this through the lens of identity politics. Another great example is you have the mayor of Oakland, who authorized the violent repression of Occupy Oakland and authorized Alameda County sheriffs and OPD to shoot people and gas them and put them in cages and torture them in those cages, talking about how the reason people were rioting is because they're racist, because she's a person of color, and therefore they don't like her leadership. And that's the reason that people are resisting, not because their homes are foreclosed on, not because they're attacked on a daily basis by the racist police, not because of any of the reasons why poor people and people of color and exploited people of all stripes are revolting in Oakland. And so, I don't know. I think that it's hard to say how some of these problematics are going to play out, but I think that it's a question that we have to have at the forefront of our theory and our activity. And the way we have to go about this is to just have a better analysis of gender and a better analysis of race and a better analysis of all forms of oppression in a way that can't be captured by the state, can't be used by the police, can't be used by the capitalist institutions, by the nonprofits. And I think this means like theorizing about identity a lot, and I think it means going to the questions that are hard to talk about and the ugly questions. And I'm excited to present a lot of the essays in this because they talk about that from that perspective. And I think that Bashback has a really interesting perspective that I want to share. So there's also the question of the academy, which I kind of read from, so I don't feel like I need to cover that much more at length. But the last question to talk about is this question of politics, of what it means to engage in politics, what it means to participate in projects. I'll start by pointing out an author who is really useful to my way of thinking about this, who actually is going on a tour around the country right now. I'm not sure if she's spoken here yet, but her name's Selma James, and she's an autonomous feminist who was really active in the 70s and is still active, but she was among a group of radical women in the 70s theorizing this idea of like women's autonomy and autonomous Marxist feminism. And she's going on a tour right now, which is interesting because her theories from the 70s are wonderful and amazing and are like super useful and on point. But now she's kind of become she's a little bit of a wingnut now. People at a recent talk asked her about, like, you know, she talks a lot about gender, but they asked her what she thought of trans people, and she wasn't really aware that transgender people existed. And but she's like one of the main names in feminism. It's kind of shocking. She talked about, for example, how like Hugo Chavez's government is wonderful and is the most uncorruptible government in the world, and she described Israeli people as diabolical, which has all sorts of really messed up implications. But anyway, so she has this like, she's totally a wingnut now, and I actually wouldn't recommend going to her talk if she comes here. But I do recommend that you read two things by her. One is a pamphlet called Sex, Race, Class, and the other is an introduction she wrote to a text called The Power of Women and the Subversion of Community by an Italian autonomous feminist named Maria Rosa Dalla Costa. And in the introduction to this, Selma James sets up this really beautiful dialectic thinking about politics, where she says that within the women's movement in the 70s, there were two types of ways of being part of the women's movement. On the one hand, there are what she calls, in a somewhat transphobic way, the Marxist men in drag, who were the women who just like towed the party line, and that was it. And then there were the women who focus on women's issues, but yet never connected them to a revolutionary struggle. And so I like this dialectic because it sets up for me a real problem within queer theory too, that you have either people engaged in resistance who happen to be queer, but that is kind of like ignored and is not a central part of this like critique of society on the part of their comrades, or you have people who focus on queer issues, but that like those issues become reformist in and of themselves and are disconnected from a revolutionary struggle. And so I like this way of thinking because what James does in trying to set up this dialectic is she tries to look for a way outside of that, a way that takes gender as not an issue, but as a central category of capitalism, and looks at how gendered relationships reproduce every other aspect of the capitalist mode of production. And so in doing so, she tries to look for something where the struggle of women is central to overthrowing capitalism, and it takes all of their issues as like a main revolutionary project. And so for James and for Dalla Costa and for Silvia Federici and for this whole world of autonomous feminists, this meant analyzing the role of housewives in Italy and elsewhere, and talking about how their specific position within capitalism had revolutionary potential. They used the language of talking about levers, about how like we all can find the exact point within our own lives where we actually have subversive revolutionary potential to overthrow the existing order. And this isn't just an issue, and this isn't something to be dealt with after the revolution, and it's like this central task is to look at our position and figure out like how we relate to class society within that, and then find how that allows us to struggle. A lot of people make a mistake, a lot of people who are really into Selma James make a mistake of taking her ideas and then just trying to blanket apply them to our situation, which obviously is wrong. I'm not going to foreclose on the possibility that people in this room are housewives, but I feel like it's unlikely that like their analysis of the role of housewives through the 50s and the 70s in Italy really has that much to do with, I mean, it definitely doesn't have that much to do with my lived experience, and for queer people in general, it is, it just doesn't necessarily match up, specifically because, they talk about women being excluded from the factory and excluded from the labor pool, and thus being relegated to the home and the nuclear family. And I think to a huge extent the condition of queer people is a double exclusion from traditional forms of labor and from traditional forms of labor organizing, but then also from the family. I mean, how many of us actually like live with our nuclear families or could go back to live with our nuclear families if we needed to? I mean, it's absurd. And so I'm interested in critiquing the conclusions that came to by the autonomous feminists, but taking their methodology and applying it to our activity. I want to like ask the question of what are the specifics of queer life within capitalism? How are we exploited and excluded? And what positions of attack does that give us? What modes of organizing can we use? And so to me, it's really important that this methodology of autonomy is a break from traditional politics and is a break from activism. I think that people can forge alliances, and I think people can struggle along one another and can find commonality in their struggle, but I kind of refuse this activist idea that we act for other people. I think that we have to act for like the social bodies that we're a part of, and then draw connections of struggle with the people who are also struggling and who are struggling against the same people as us. And so for me, I want to escape the dialectic that is set up by Selma James through her methodology, but I want to actually look at like what is our position. And I think that as the crisis of capitalism unfolds and as it gets worse, I don't think any of us are under any delusions that the crisis is going away. I think that we need to look at what is the position of exploited people, and I think this means that we have to discard of a lot of old models. It means that we have to discard of unions that only serve to like maintain the most privileged elements of the middle class, and that it means that we need to look outside of these like old forms of organizing and specifically look at what are our needs and how can we accomplish them through our own autonomous activity. I really like looking into the history of ACT UP. There's a militant and often forgotten tendency within ACT UP that involved people looting and stealing AIDS drugs and distributing them to people who were denied them. That involves robbing banks and using them to fund people buying AIDS drugs for people who couldn't afford them. One of the major characteristics of the crisis in California right now, in Georgia, and actually 12 states across the country right now, is that ADAP, the AIDS Drug Assistance Program, is being totally devastated and all funding is cut. So for people who are reliant on that program for their very survival, this is a death sentence on the part of the state. And so one of the questions posed by this theory of queer autonomy is, in response to the crisis, how will queer people struggle, and how will anyone with HIV struggle to meet our needs and like survive, and how will we make sure that our loved ones survive? That's a question. As a kind of like rampant reactionary tendency emerges where like the family is reasserted as how people survive and get through the hard times, with it comes the heteronormative ideology that leads to queer bashing, that leads to our exclusion. And so if our needs cannot be met through this safety net of the family that so many people are turning to in rampant unemployment, we'll have to create our own forms of providing for one another. To me, this goes back to the Star House, which is the Street Transaction Revolutionary House founded by Marsha P. Johnson, where trans street workers got together and like took care of their needs collectively. To me, this is also related to the Marsha P. Johnson Squad, opened by Bashback Memphis. To me, this means that we'll have to. To me, it's related to the reason that the exploited youth in London, in Philadelphia, in Milwaukee, in Florida, go into large stores and distribution centers and collectively take things. It's why anytime there's a revolt on the part of the excluded in this country, the LA riots being a huge example, that looting is a huge part of it. To me, it's this fact that like those of us who are totally excluded from the means to reproduce ourselves and take care of ourselves through the formal economy, then also excluded from the family structures that people rely on when they are excluded from that economy, that we'll have to develop means of struggling. We'll have to occupy buildings, we'll have to take things, we'll have to, when we need to eat, we'll have to find ways of getting food. When we need drugs, we need ways of getting them. When we need a place to be safe, we'll need to create shelter. And to me, these are the kind of like tactics or modes that get outside of a political framework, but instead like are rooted in our daily experience. I think sex workers will need to organize collectively to defend themselves against Johns. I think people will need to organize self-defense trainings. I think people will need to distribute self-defense implements in the way that Bashback did. I think we might have to go back to this idea of house culture, where exploited queer youth like get together and form crews or gangs or houses. I think there's an infinite number of ways that we'll have to obstruct the economy that excludes us, attack and defend ourselves against the state and the queer bashers who attack us, and that we'll have to provide means for our own survival. I think that this has to come outside of traditional activism. I think this has to come out of reliance on the state. I think it can't come from the nonprofit industrial complex. And thus that leaves us with the answer of autonomy, that it has to come from us, it has to come from our activity. And so, I guess I'll end there, because I think it's a question rather than an answer, and I feel like I don't have any answers. I have some. I feel like this book has some, but I want to hear like what the way we talk about that question together and like thinking about our own roles. So I need to take a break before we start discussing these things.